Hi, I'm Sofia. Welcome to my talk about the Postgraduate Programme in Specialised Translation, which I undertook at KU Leuven in Antwerp in Belgium last year. So I'll introduce myself and explain why I decided to take this course and quite the convoluted application process I went to, arriving in Antwerp and then enrolling at KU Leuven. I'll run through the subjects that I studied in the course and what I found interesting and helpful because it was a very practical course. And the third part will be a quick overview of the internship and then also my overall impression of the course. So I was born in Yekaterinburg in Russia back when it was still called Sverdlovsk. In 1994, my family immigrated to Melbourne, Australia, where I then completed my primary and secondary schooling. I then completed a Bachelor of Physiotherapy from the University of Melbourne in 2007, and then I spent 4 years working as a paediatric physiotherapist at a special school in Melbourne. But I found physiotherapy quite difficult, and over time I became more and more interested in translating, which was actually a strange hobby of mine when I was a teenager. So I was very keen to initially study translating and interpreting in Australia, but unfortunately the courses in Australia only offer a limited number of foreign languages, and I have to say Russian wasn't really one of them. In 2011, I then applied to 3 different universities in the UK, and I was accepted in all 3 of them. But unfortunately, the price for a non-EU student at the time was about £12,000 per year, and I was unsuccessful in getting any scholarships. So this was really disappointing, but at around the same time, I heard about an internship program being offered in Israel. So instead of doing the university course, I spent 4 months at a translation agency in near Tel Aviv. So after that internship, it went on my CV, after which I got my first editing job, and then over time, that's basically how my career developed. In 2017, I successfully passed the NAATI certification exam, which in Australia means that I'm able to translate official documents, for example, for immigration purposes. But during all this time, and after all these years of working, I still wanted formal education in translating and interpreting, so I still felt like I was missing out on something, even though obviously my physiotherapy degree was really helpful in medical translation, which is what I specialise in. So after quite a lot of searching on the internet, in 2018, I found this postgraduate program in Specialised Translation, which is a 1-year course being offered by the KU Leuven, a university in Antwerp in Belgium. It's taught in English and it's designed for university students who have either completed their bachelor or master's in translation, but also it suits practicing language professionals. And its unique feature is that most of its subjects are language neutral, which means that a translator with any language combination can undertake these courses as long as English is one of the working languages, because a lot of the practice that we did was either to or from, mainly from English. There were a few subjects that also formed part of the masters, but these were called translation workshops and they were actually taught in Dutch. So for that, you needed to be either a Belgian student or from the Netherlands. And this course appears quite unique in that it has a focus on being up to date and delivering lots of practical information and skills that are quite relevant to working language professionals, especially when I talked to other students that completed their masters or bachelors. They spoke about a lot of theory that they learned, but this course was very, very practical. And most subjects revolved around various software used in our industry, from software translation platforms like Crowdin to the different CAT tools to subtitling software. And I'll touch on some of those programs later on. And last but not least, I was quite amazed to find that the whole course cost €2,000 for the year. And the price was actually the same for both EU and non-EU students. So for someone like me hunting around for courses for years in the UK or in Europe, I was finding that translation courses would start from like €10,000 a year in Sweden to about €20,000 for 1 year of study in the UK. Can we please get the audio segment playing? Thanks.
What do I know about diamonds? I'm a boxing promoter. I was a happy boxing promoter until a week ago. And then, what do I know about diamonds? Don't they come from Antwerp?
Thank you. So the point of that is basically to admit that I knew about Antwerp pretty much as Turkish knew about Antwerp in the movie Snatch. So after I was reading on the website that the language of Antwerp was Dutch, I'd actually assumed that it was in the Netherlands. And I was really disappointed initially to find out it was not the case, mainly because I knew nothing about Belgium. And even when I went to the local library, I couldn't find any books on it. So it was quite scary moving to a country that I knew almost nothing about. But actually, Belgium has 3 different official languages. So there's a Dutch-speaking part, which is where Antwerp is located. There's a French-speaking part, which is where Brussels is located, even though they're quite close together. And then there's also a tiny German-speaking part of the country. And perhaps for this reason, the level of English in the country is very high. So I didn't have any communication problems while I was there. And the official population is about 500,000 people. And Antwerp has been a town of significant importance for hundreds of years, and this is for mainly 2 reasons. So one, it's got the second biggest port in all of Europe after Rotterdam, and it's an important trade link with the rest of mainland Europe. And Antwerp is also considered the diamond capital of the world because it has a very large and flourishing diamond district, and it trades in both rough and polished diamonds. And culturally, Antwerp is actually considered one of the world fashion capitals, so alongside London and Paris and New York. And it was also home to a few very famous painters, such as Peter Paul Rubens and Anthony van Dyck. So getting back to the university course, apologies, I first had to be accepted into the course and then obtain the Belgian student visa. And to my great surprise, actually, the latter turned out to be much more difficult than the former, which I wasn't expecting at all. So firstly, to get into the postgraduate program, one had to either provide evidence of a previous degree in translation or evidence of previous work experience. So in my case, the KU Leuven, the university, asked for my diploma and my academic transcript from my bachelor at the University of Melbourne. And then I had to provide 2 recommendation letters from past clients, a CV, and a motivational letter. And for anyone who might be interested in this course who's not based in the EU, I would say apply early because you need to leave yourself lots of time for the dreaded part 2, as I call it, which is actually getting the Belgian visa. So to be able to remain in Belgium for more than 3 months, so they do have a short-term visa, but this is for longer studies, and this is called a Type D long stay visa. You had to actually fill out a lot of paperwork, and it ended up costing quite a lot of money. So there was multiple steps. I had to get an up-to-date national police check, which then had to be apostilled by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I had to undergo some very specific medical tests. For some reason, Belgium wanted a chest x-ray for tuberculosis and a blood test for syphilis, and no one could explain to me why those 2. I then had to have a medical assessment with a particular doctor that was approved by the Embassy of Belgium, and in all of Melbourne, there were only 2 such doctors. Then I had to pay so I had to fill out 2 different forms and then pay 2 different application fees, even though they both went to the same place and were basically sent to the embassy so that they would process my application. And then last but not least, I had to demonstrate that I was able to financially support myself during the studies, and this is called proof of solvency. So I guess unlike other countries that might just ask for a bank statement, Belgium turns out has a very strict procedure to ensure that you're financially solvent. What this involved is that I had to transfer a set amount of money to a locked bank account at KU Leuven, and then for the following 12 months, they would transfer 700 euros every month to my working bank account in Belgium. So I understand the purpose of doing this, but I obviously found it very frustrating that I didn't have access to my own money for a year. And on top of that, I would say that 700 euros is actually not enough to live on in Belgium per month. For example, my student room alone costs 600 euro for the month. So in conclusion of all that, I guess the course itself I found very affordable, but it's important to note that the process of applying for it is very time consuming, and time is money, as they say. And once I had arrived in Belgium, I discovered that enrollment was also quite confusing, and it involved multiple steps. So first I had to travel to the main campus at Leuven to then enroll again in person. Next, although I had been reassured that accommodation would be easy to find, this actually turned out to be not the case. So even though Antwerp has an online database called Cotweb, which is, it displays all the authorized student rooms called COTs, by the time I'd arrived a couple of weeks out from the start of the course, 99% of those student rooms were gone. So I had an Airbnb room that I'd rented for 2 weeks, and I was frantically running around trying to find a place to stay. And I was also surprised to find that Belgium keeps very careful tabs on where everyone lives. So once my accommodation contract was signed, the university informed the local police, and the local police actually had to do a check to make sure that I was living where I said I was living. And so this was standard procedure for basically all foreign students. So I hope everyone hasn't fallen asleep during that prolonged introduction of administrative woe. I'm going to get to the actual course now. So the degree goes for 1 year, but all the theory takes place in the first semester. A student can choose 5 subjects out of a possible 7 that you see on the screen. And I've highlighted in red the subjects that I picked that I'm going to talk about. And the second semester is dedicated to the internship, which I'll mention at the end. What was also nice that it was possible to study this course part-time, so someone could pick 1 or 2 subjects only. For example, one of my friends was working in Brussels 4 days of the week, and then she was only coming once a week to Antwerp just to do the CAT tool subject. So to start off with this CAT tools, which was the most popular subject, and it was one of the subjects offered at the undergraduate level at the university. So we had over 40 students enrolled, and they had split us up into 2 groups to make it more manageable. And about 80% of the subject was dedicated to Trado Studio 2019. We started with the basics. So I think for people who had never dealt with a CAT tool before, things like what is a translation memory, what are fuzzy and perfect matches, what's an XLIF document, etc. And first we practiced translating a single document, and then progressed to actually creating project in Trado Studio, and then importing and exporting packages. So I guess we looked at things from a freelancer point of view, but also from what a project manager would need to do if they were working in an agency. And then we also learnt numerous shortcuts in Trado Studio, and then went more in depth to practice using filters, batch tasks, and parsing rules. And we also briefly covered programs like SDL Group Share and Multilingual, although it was funny that the lecturer almost immediately told us that it was much easier to use a free app that SDL offered called Glossary Converter, for example, instead of using the official multi-term software. We learned about things like legacy documents and creating new translation memories, etc. And so despite myself working as a translator since 2012 already, I hadn't really used SDL Trados before, and I did think it'd be quite scary to try and learn it myself, so this subject was quite helpful. But unfortunately, I guess a lot of the information I received just confirmed or reinforced my opinion that it was an overly complicated program. It had too many options, most of which I'd never used. And even now, 6 months after the course, after the theory part of the course had finished, I find that I'm forgetting a lot of details. And I had to refer to my notes when I was creating this presentation. But part of the issue for me, of course, is that I work on a Mac laptop, and so I don't actually have Trados installed because I didn't want to get into the whole boot camp or running parallels on my laptop. But if you do like SDL Trados, or you hope to work with it in the future, there was also a couple of perks included in the course. So for example, we could sit the SDL Trados Studio exams for free. It was included in the subject. And then 2 of the exams, the Getting Started and the Advanced one, actually formed part of our marks for this subject. And then if you pass the exams, you can actually display the logo on your website or on your profile page, which is quite handy. And then on top of that, as a student of the course, we were given free access to SDL Charter Studio for 1 year, but the program could only be used for practice or for study, not for paid work. Again, unfortunately, because I have a Mac, I couldn't make use of that great offer. And then we also had a few classes dedicated to MemSource, but these consisted mostly of a group project where the lecturer had found a real client for us, which sounded like a great idea in theory, but in reality, because we had so many students with different language combinations, it turned out to be very messy to try to group us all together in equal groups. And for the same reason, we didn't have time to actually learn about MemSource from our lecturer. We got thrown into the deep end and had to figure things out as we go, which, I mean, I always considered MemSource quite straightforward, but then when we looked at the project management side of things, I was actually surprised by how complicated it got. So the next subject is audiovisual translation, and this was by far the most relaxing and enjoyable subject in the course, and it was a definite favorite among the students. So it was completely hands-on, and we used a software called Swift, which is no longer being supported by its developers, but that was the software installed at the computer lab. And one of the very first things we learnt in the subject was readability, or making sure that there's not too much text on the screen and that it stayed on the screen long enough for the viewer to be able to watch it, to read it. And readability is measured in CPS, which is characters per second. So when we translated, we had to make sure that the CPS was 13 or less for foreign language subtitles and 17 or less for closed captioning or monolingual subtitles. And this, of course, created a lot of angst among students who had to translate into German, for example. And even I struggled translating from English to Russian because Russian words do tend to be longer than the English ones. But then we had one Chinese student who, for her, it was obviously a breeze. She could translate a whole line of text in just 4 characters. And secondly, we had to ensure that a subtitle stayed on the screen for at least 1 second, but no longer than 6 seconds. And thirdly, a single subtitle could not be more than 2 lines long, which meant that, you know, if there was some rapid fire conversation on the screen, you had to really choose what you wanted to show as a subtitle. And it was also important to ensure that the subtitle appeared at the exact moment that a person started speaking, which was something we practiced a lot, catching that exact frame when someone opened their mouth or when the first sound appeared. But also to make sure that the subtitle didn't disappear as soon as they stopped speaking, since reading is slower than speaking generally. And then as the course went on, we also learnt to pay attention to shot changes, which is when there's a cut in the filming. So when a scene changes or the film angle changes, to make sure that a subtitle either stopped a few frames before or a few frames after the shot change, so that the viewer didn't have the sort of double whammy of having the subtitle disappear and then having the shot change. And of course, our subtitles couldn't be too close together, so we also had to count the number of frames between them. And so all in all, it made subtitling a sort of interesting puzzle you had to figure out, all the while creating accurate but succinct translations. Something that I found quite memorable was a guest lecturer we had who talked about surtitles, which are subtitles displayed in theatres and opera, usually so that the local audience can listen to a foreign language production. And I had never seen surtitles before in Australia, so it was a really interesting concept that I enjoyed learning about. So multilingual workflow management was probably the most time-consuming and stressful subject, in my opinion. It is taught online as our lecturer is based in France, and she's a very experienced project manager who runs her own translation company. So the subject provided a detailed breakdown of the steps involved in managing a translation or a language project, and what is required to run a successful agency, both from a financial but also from a practical point of view. So we learnt about which linguistic steps were required to deliver a high quality translation. So not just translation and revision, but linguistic quality assurance, language sign-off, and things like that. We also discussed DTP, when it was needed, what was involved, and how it could be integrated into the process to make sure that there weren't extra errors added on at the end. And surprisingly, actually, the subject involved a lot of maths. So we spent a lot of time talking about rates and metrics, trying to work out how many words or pages could be done per hour or per day, and thus what were the realistic prices for those steps, both from the point of view of a freelancer, but also from the point of view of a project manager who might be working in an agency that needs to have a gross margin for every project. So this is what I mean by metrics, assuming that a certain number of words could be translated per day or per hour, and then in order to calculate how many days a project would take, and having to keep in mind things like public holidays, translator sicknesses, weekends, things like that. Or in the second case, this is an example of a metric for DTP. So estimating how many pages of a document could undergo DTP per hour, depending on the program that was used, because some of them were more complicated than others. Oops, sorry. So this naturally led to a discussion about estimating the duration of projects, keeping in mind all those factors I talked about before, like weekends and public holidays and linguist availability. And we practiced overlapping, which is when a subsequent step in the project is started before the previous one is finished. But for example, we had to keep in mind that the reviser works 3 times as fast as a translator. So you had to be careful to make sure that the reviser didn't overtake the translator and run out of things to do during a lengthy project. And we also discussed using multiple translators or revisers for large projects and how to balance speed with consistency. For example, trying to have a minimum number of revisers and having perhaps only one LQA specialist whose job would then be to integrate all the different parts that had been translated into a seamless whole. And we also practiced creating quotes, purchase orders, invoices, so that we knew exactly what was needed to be included for practical and legal reasons. And we even had a discussion about VAT. So for example, that there's differences in how you quote VAT depending on whether both the client and the linguist or the agency is in the same country, or whether they're in different countries but still part of the EU, or whether one of you is actually outside of the EU, which I guess was interesting for me since I don't charge tax, since my clients are always overseas and I'm based in Australia. And finally, we learned about project tracking and how to track the different steps to make sure that nothing's missed, that linguists submit work on time. And our lecturer even showed us how she arranges files and folders in her computer. And we were asked to present theoretically how we would arrange our files if we were managing a project. So software and website localization. This slide actually covers 2 different subjects, but I decided to include them all on one slide because they were mainly taught by the same lecturer. And the 2 subjects integrated quite well with multilingual workflow management. For example, we learnt about DTP and which software could be used to localize products with visual content. We also learnt the basics of Adobe Photoshop, and we used it to localize images, a process the lecturer called faking, which was a fun activity, kind of like, I don't know, coloring in kindergarten, but it was also very slow and time consuming. So if you can imagine, we'd receive images which had a lot of colors and text and different pictures and things. And then we had to very, very carefully erase the source text and then insert our translations while matching the exact font, size, text, making sure it didn't take too much space, etc. And as part of software localization, we also learned some basic coding. We also learned how to recognize translatable content that could be translated and which parts of the HTML, for example, should be left well alone so that you don't actually break the code. And we were given, for example, some coding documents that had some text that was broken. So then we had to fix it ourselves to figure out which part of the program, of the coding had actually been deleted or altered. And we fixed these errors mostly in Notepad++, which sadly, once again, I can't run on my Mac laptop. And while most of these subjects were also very practical and hands-on, so we did a lot of practicing things ourselves in class, we also had some theory sessions about SEO and localization for different markets. So we talked about how global companies adjust their marketing messages for different cultures and how they go about achieving what they want. So just to briefly cover the second semester, which was all dedicated to the internship, and that had to be at least 450 hours, and it had to take place between February and June this year. It could be done either in Belgium or overseas. It could be paid or unpaid. And the internship could involve any combination of the topics that we'd covered. So anything from project management to LQA to translation, etc. For privacy reasons, I don't really want to go into my personal internship, but I wanted to talk about the general experience of trying to find an internship, which was left up to me. And I found it very difficult for me, and I know other non-EU students had a similar problem. So the university gave us a list of suggested companies, but these were mostly in Belgium, and for obvious reasons, these agencies preferred students who could speak or translate French, Dutch, or German, and I don't speak any of those languages. And so even though my A language is English, and I was assuming that was going to make it easier for me to find a position, for example, doing project management or doing English language reviews, most agencies were not interested in taking me on as an intern until finally an agency in St. Petersburg did agree to take me. So as an overall impression, as you've probably gathered, I had sort of mixed feelings about my experience of studying in Belgium. If I talk about the course itself, it was very practical, it was very industry focused, and I learned a lot in that one semester. It was quite fast paced, and we had lots of information thrown at us every week. So for someone like me who had been out of university for a number of years, it sometimes felt overwhelming, but I'm glad that I learned everything that I did in it. It was nice. It was a nice small group. I think there was less than 15 students in total for the course, and plus we didn't all do the same subjects. So some classes were even smaller, and it was really fun at times. For example, subtitling scenes out of Faulty Towers or Shrek, or having to do localization for like a colorful poster about Pokemon, etc. And I was also very glad about the perks that we received, such as the SDL and MEMSOR certification. But what I found quite disappointing was just the huge amount of bureaucracy around enrolling in the course and around getting the student visa to come to Belgium. And a lot of the paperwork actually felt like it was not really necessary, and I couldn't really understand the purpose of having quite so much that had to be done. And I also believe that the process of coming to study in Belgium was more stressful for a non-EU student. And to my complete surprise, there were no additional supports in place at the university for students like me. So, for example, the Faculty of Arts had an Erasmus program coordinator, but foreign students who were not on the Erasmus program, and there were some of us, were sort of left to our own devices completely. And similarly, trying to find an internship was, I found, quite a demotivating process, especially when you try for several months and you just receive no's all the time. I initially had thought the university would find an internship for us, but then that wasn't the case. And so our experiences, different students had very different experiences. My Belgian friend, I think, got her first choice, basically. She got an internship really quickly at a place in Brussels. But then for others like me, especially if our languages weren't FIGs, it was a much more difficult process. So I think those factors would be good to keep in mind if you're a student who is interested in this course, or perhaps something that the university might work on in the future. That's it from me. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hello. Yes, there is a rather blunt question, So can you measure how did it help you in your work? So it's before the course and after the course, in terms of productivity, for example, or in terms of obtaining new clients via these certifications, all that. Did it help you, or?
I think it's hard to measure in terms of getting new clients, since clients don't tell you that, oh, I saw that you graduated this course, so that's why I decided to contact you. But in terms of knowledge, I felt like I learned a lot. I became more confident about using CAT tools, since previously I was just using them just blindly. So MemSource, MemoQ, SmartCat, I learnt them as I go. while in this case, I realized that there were more functions that I had been ignoring previously. And then in terms of software and website localization, this was a field I'd never worked in before, which I found quite terrifying. So it's nice to sort of have at least a base to be able to understand a bit more about what's involved and what it takes.